In the spring of 1970, on a dirt road outside Lamar, Missouri, Michael Bennett pulled his John Deere truck to the shoulder and cut the engine. Through the windshield, past the layer of dust coating the glass, he watched something he thought had died with the last century. A woman plowing with mules. Not just any woman. Evelyn Whitmore. 55 years old, 5'7", shoulders broad from 3 decades of work that would break most men. Her hair had gone silver-white years ago, cropped short and tucked under a faded red bandana. The skin on her face told the story of every summer sun and winter wind, brown as old leather, creased deep around eyes the color of lake water under a clear sky. She wore men's denim coveralls patched at both knees, a flannel shirt that had been red once but now leaned closer to pink, and boots that came up past her ankles caked in Missouri clay. The mules were a matched pair. Duke. The larger of the two stood 16 hands at the shoulder with a coat the color of charcoal. Duchess, smaller but meaner, had that red-brown tint that caught the light when she moved. They pulled a single-bottom plow through soil that would have needed a 4-row cultivator behind any sensible tractor. The furrows came slow, patient, one after another, turning earth that hadn't seen daylight since last autumn. Mike sat in his truck for 5 full minutes watching. Then he started to laugh. Not a chuckle, a real laugh, the kind that made his belly shake. He reached into the glove compartment, pulled out a Kodak Instamatic, and leaned out the window. The shutter clicked 3 times before Evie even noticed him there. She didn't wave, didn't stop, just kept walking behind those mules like she had all the time in the world. 20 minutes later, Mike pushed through the door of Lamar Feed and Supply, still grinning. 7 men stood around the counter near the cash register. Farmers, every one of them, white faces weathered by the same sun that had darkened Evie's. Garrett Crawford stood in the center, tallest of the bunch, at 6'2", 45 years old, with brown hair starting to thin on top. He owned 600 acres on the north side of the county, and everyone knew it. Mike didn't wait for a break in conversation. The words tumbled out. "I just saw Evelyn Whitmore, out on County Road 340, plowing with mules. Actual mules. In 1970. The store went quiet for about 3 seconds. Then Dale Morrison started laughing. Then Luther Hayes. Then all of them, voices bouncing off the tin ceiling and the stacked bags of feed corn. Garrett shook his head, disgust plain on his features. That woman. Still farming like it's 1890. It's embarrassing. A widow. Alone. With animals. We've got men on the moon and she's out there like something from a museum." Mike pulled the Instamatic from his jacket pocket and set it on the counter. "Got pictures. Thought maybe I was seeing things." Dale Morrison picked up the camera, turned it over in his hands. "You been trying to sell her a tractor for what, 10 years now?" 15. Mike's grin faded some. "Every spring she comes in, looks at the new models, asks about fuel consumption and maintenance schedules. Then she walks out. Doesn't buy a damn thing. She can't afford it," someone suggested. "The hell she can't." Garrett's voice carried weight, the kind that came from owning the most land and running the biggest operation. Evie Whitmore's sitting on 180 acres free and clear. No mortgage, no liens. Her husband paid cash for that land back in the 40s. She could buy anything she wanted. She just won't. Then she's crazy. Dale Morrison said it like he was diagnosing a sickness. Crazy or stupid or both. Stubborn, Mike offered. Stubborn as those mules she's working with. The nickname stuck. By sundown, half the county was calling her Mule Evie, or Stubborn Widow, and the other half was calling her worse. Evie heard the talk. She always did. Small towns don't keep secrets well, and Barton County was small enough that everyone knew everyone else's business before breakfast. She didn't defend herself, didn't explain, just kept working. What none of them knew, what they couldn't have known because Evie never talked about it, was that she'd learned everything she needed to know about supply lines and fuel dependency 25 years earlier, 6,000 miles from Missouri, in a place where the wrong decision could get people killed. Naples, Italy. February 1945. Corporal Evelyn Porter, Women's Army Corps, stood in a warehouse that smelled like diesel and rotting canvas and counted ammunition crates for the 3rd time that morning. 23 years old, then fresh-faced in a way she'd never be again assigned to the Supply Corps because the Army needed bodies who could count and type and keep their mouths shut about classified cargo movements. Outside the war ground, forward through mountains the locals called the Apennines. Inside, Evie tracked every gallon of gasoline, every box of rations, every case of medical supplies that kept the 5th Army fed and armed. She learned that battles weren't won by heroes charging machine gun nests. They were won by clerks who made sure the fuel trucks arrived on time and the ammunition didn't run out mid-firefight. She also learned what happened when supply lines broke. Mid-February, a convoy of 12 trucks loaded with ammunition and winter gear tried to reach forward positions in the mountains. 8 miles from the front, they ran dry. Every single truck out of gas on the same stretch of road because someone 3 levels up the command chain had miscalculated consumption rates. The convoy sat there for 6 hours. 6 hours of infantry freezing in foxholes without the coats and blankets sitting useless in truck beds 8 miles away. 6 hours of artillery running low on shells. 6 hours of medics rationing morphine because the resupply hadn't arrived. Evie watched 3 mule teams finish the delivery. 26 animals led by Italian civilians who'd been running supplies through those mountains since their grandfather's time. They didn't need gasoline, didn't need spare parts, didn't need anything except hay and water and a man who knew how to load a pack saddle. The image burned itself into her memory. Stayed there through VE Day, through the long ship ride home, through every choice she'd make for the next 50 years. She never told anyone about it. Not her parents who picked her up at the train station in Springfield still wearing her WAC uniform. Not her friends from high school who wanted to hear about dances and handsome soldiers and whether she'd seen any movie stars. Not even Clayton when she met him 6 months later at a church social where returned veterans stood awkward in civilian clothes trying to remember how to talk about anything except war. Clayton Whitmore, 30 years old in 1946, 6 feet tall, blonde hair that caught sunlight like wheat in August, brown eyes that smiled before his mouth did. He'd been infantry. 34th Division, same mountains where Evie had worked supply. They traded stories carefully at first, dancing around the parts that still woke them up at 3 in the morning. She mentioned the mule teams. He nodded, understanding immediate. Saw them myself. Only reliable transport we had when the weather turned bad. Trucks couldn't handle the ice. Mules just kept walking. They married that fall. Moved to the farm Clayton had inherited from his father, 180 acres of decent bottomland and rolling pasture in Barton County, Missouri. The farmhouse needed work. 2 stories built in 1895 with good bones but 40 years of deferred maintenance. Clayton started repairs the week they moved in. Their daughter arrived the following May. They named her Judith after Evie's grandmother, a healthy baby with blonde hair like her father's and blue eyes that would turn the same shade as her mother's by her 2nd birthday. Evie nursed her in the rocking chair by the upstairs window looking out over fields. Clayton worked from dawn until the light failed. He bought the first tractor in 1947. A Farmall M painted that distinctive red that International Harvester used fresh from the dealer in Lamar. $1,200 paid in cash from money they'd saved while Clayton worked construction through the winter. The tractor changed everything. What took 2 weeks with a horse team Clayton could finish in 4 days. What would have required hiring help he managed alone. 7 years later, he bought a second. The Farmall 400 newest model International Harvester made. Hydraulics. Live power takeoff. Could pull a 4-bottom plow through heavy clay without straining. $2,800 also paid in cash, also bought without borrowing a dime. Evie suggested something during those years that Clayton initially dismissed, then reconsidered, then agreed, made sense in a way he couldn't quite articulate. Keep the old mule team, just in case. They maintained 2 mules, the gelding they'd bought from a neighbor and a mare Clayton had traded for in 1948. Fed them, kept their hooves trimmed, occasionally worked them on small jobs when the tractors sat idle. Insurance, Evie called it. Insurance against what Clayton never asked and Evie never specified. They saved aggressively. Every dollar that didn't go toward keeping the farm running went into an account at Lamar Farmers Bank. By 1955 they had $14,000 sitting untouched, earning interest at 3% annually. Enough to buy more land if the opportunity came. Enough to survive a bad crop year without selling equipment. Enough to feel secure in a way that mattered more to Evie than Clayton, though he never questioned her need for it. May 1955. Spring planting season, corn going in the ground in neat rows behind the Farmall 400. Clayton worked alone that morning because Evie had taken Judith to town for new shoes. 8 years old, growing faster than they could keep her clothed. The tractor hit a buried stump or a rock, or maybe just soft ground that gave way. Unexpected witnesses later couldn't agree. What mattered was the result. The Farmall 400 tipped sideways, rolled once, and landed upside down in a ravine 20 feet deep. Clayton died before anyone found him, crushed under 3,000 pounds of machinery, still holding the steering wheel, when the neighbor who heard the crash climbed down to check. He was 40 years old, buried 3 days later in the cemetery behind First Baptist Church, where half the county turned out to pay respects to a good man taken too early. Evie stood by the grave in a black dress she'd borrowed because she didn't own one. Judith cried into her mother's skirt, too young to understand that Daddy wasn't coming home, but old enough to know something terrible had broken. People spoke in low voices about tragic accidents and God's will and how quickly life could change. They meant well. Evie heard maybe 1 word in 10. What she heard clearly in the weeks that followed was the assumption. The absolute certainty in every conversation, every sideways glance, every offer of help that came with strings attached. A widow with a young daughter couldn't possibly run a farm alone. The sensible thing, the only thing really, would be to sell. Harold Peterson called her into Lamar Farmers Bank 6 weeks after the funeral. 52 years old, gray hair thinning on top glasses, perched on a nose that had been broken sometime in his youth and healed crooked. He'd been bank manager for 15 years, knew every farmer in the county by name, knew their credit history, knew which ones would make it and which ones were already sinking beneath debt they'd never climb out from under. He gestured to the chair across from his desk. Evie sat back straight, hands folded in her lap. Judith waited outside with the secretary coloring in a book the woman kept for children who came with their parents. Harold opened a folder, scanned the contents, though he clearly already knew what they contained. Mrs. Whitmore, first let me say how sorry I am for your loss. Clayton was a good man, a good customer, always paid on time, never asked for extensions. Thank you. I've been looking at your accounts. You have $14,000 in savings. The farm is owned free and clear, no mortgage, no liens. That's an excellent position financially speaking. Evie waited. She'd learned during the war that the important part of any conversation came after the preamble. Harold closed the folder, removed his glasses, cleaned them on his tie. That said, running a farm is hard work. Hard for a man with help. Nearly impossible for a woman alone with a child to raise. I'm not saying this to be unkind, Mrs. Whitmore. I'm saying it because I've seen what happens when people take on more than they can handle. I can handle it. With respect, you can't. Oh, you might manage for a season, maybe 2. But farming takes strength. Takes knowledge of equipment and markets and timing that comes from experience. It's no reflection on your character to admit. Her voice cut through his quiet but firm enough that he stopped mid-sentence. Mr. Peterson, my husband and I ran that farm together for 9 years. I know every acre. I know what grows well where. I know when to plant and when to harvest. I can operate both tractors, maintain them, repair minor problems. I've kept the books since we married. I know our costs, our yields, our profit margins. Harold put his glasses back on, studying her like he was seeing someone different than who'd walked through his door. That's all true. But the physical labor, I'll hire help for the heavy work. Day laborers during planting and harvest. I can afford it. And what about when you can't? One bad year, Mrs. Whitmore. One drought or early frost or price collapse and you'll be in trouble. The sensible thing, and I say this as your banker and your friend, would be to sell while land prices are good. You could get perhaps $200 an acre. That's $36,000 plus your $14,000 in savings, $50,000 total. You could buy a house in town, live, comfortably raise Judith without the burden of no. The word hung in the air between them. Harold leaned back in his chair, fingers drumming on the folder. Mrs. Whitmore, I'm trying to help you. I understand, and I appreciate it, but the answer is no. Her hands remained folded, calm, while her heart hammered against her ribs, hard enough she worried he might hear it. My husband and I built that farm together. Every improvement, every acre, every dollar saved. I made him a promise when we married, for better or worse. That promise doesn't end because he's gone. This isn't about promises. It's about practical reality. The practical reality is I have $14,000 and no debt. What exactly is the risk to your bank? Harold started to answer, started again. The risk is you'll fail. 2 years from now, maybe 3, you'll come back here asking for a loan to cover operating costs. And I'll have to decide whether to extend credit to a failing operation or deny you and watch the farm go to auction. Then I'll make sure that doesn't happen. How, by not failing? Evie stood, smoothing the skirt of her dress. If there's nothing else, Mr. Peterson, I need to pick up Judith. Harold rose as well, manners ingrained despite his frustration. Mrs. Whitmore, please. Think about this. Talk to your family. Don't make a decision out of grief or stubbornness that you'll regret when I've thought about it. She met his eyes, held them. The farm stays. If you need me to sign anything confirming that I'm keeping the accounts here, I'm happy to do that. Otherwise, we're done. She walked out, collected Judith from the secretary's desk, drove home in Clayton's Ford pickup, hands steady on the wheel despite the tremor running through her chest. That night, after Judith fell asleep, Evie sat at the kitchen table with the ledger books spread before her and calculated exactly how long she could survive without selling a thing. The answer, assuming normal crop yields and no major disasters, came to approximately 7 years before the savings ran dry. 7 years to prove Harold Peterson and everyone else wrong. She'd need longer than that. The next morning, Winslow Ashcroft appeared at her door. 72 years old, retired from farming 5 years earlier after his wife died. He lived alone in a small house half a mile down the road, spent his days tending a vegetable garden and fixing small engines for neighbors who couldn't afford mechanics. White hair, white beard, trimmed short shoulders still broad despite his age. He held a toolbox in one hand and a thermos in the other. His voice came rough, unpracticed from days alone. Heard you're keeping the place. Word travels fast. Small county. He shifted his weight, uncomfortable with whatever he'd come to say. Look, I knew Clayton since he was a boy. Good man. Better farmer. I imagine you're getting plenty of advice from people who don't know a cultivator from a combine. Most of it's probably garbage. Evie leaned against the doorframe. Is this where you add your own garbage to the pile? No, ma'am. This is where I offer to teach you the things Clayton didn't have time to. The grin that crossed his features held equal parts mischief and challenge. If you're stubborn enough to keep farming, you're stubborn enough to learn how to do it right. I don't need charity, Mr. Ashcroft. Good. I'm not offering charity. I'm offering trade. You let me teach you equipment maintenance and repair. I get to feel useful again instead of sitting at home waiting to die. Seems fair. Evie considered. Judith appeared behind her, peering around her mother's hip at the old man on the porch. What's in the thermos? Wynne held it up. Coffee. Your mother looks like she could use some, and I made too much. Do you take sugar? 3 spoons. Wynne's grin widened. Same as your daddy used to. That decided it. Evie stepped back, opening the door wider. Come in then. But if you're going to teach me, we start today. I don't have time to waste. Wynne Ashcroft became a fixture at the farm over the following years. He showed up 3 mornings a week, toolbox in hand, and walked Evie through the mysteries of hydraulic systems and carburetor adjustments and the particular temperament of international harvester transmissions. He didn't soften lessons or speak to her like she was fragile. When she made mistakes, he pointed them out bluntly. When she learned quickly, he grunted approval and moved to the next topic. By 1958, Evie could tear down an engine and rebuild it, could troubleshoot electrical problems, replace worn bearings, adjust valve clearances. She ran the Farmall M and the Farmall 400 through planting and harvest, hired day laborers for work. She couldn't manage alone, paid them from the savings account, and watched the balance drop steadily. That fall, after the harvest came in and the grain sold and the profit margin calculated to exactly $4,200, she made a decision that would define the next 40 years. She parked both tractors in the barn, covered them with canvas tarps, and brought the mules out of semi-retirement. Wynne found her in the barn on a Saturday morning, greasing the harness that hadn't seen regular use in a decade. He watched from the doorway, saying nothing until she looked up. I know what you're thinking. Her hands kept working, methodical. You're thinking I've lost my mind. Haven't thought that once. Wynne stepped inside, closed the door behind him against the October wind. Thinking you did some math and didn't like the answer. Fuel costs $320 a year. Maintenance another $180. Insurance, storage, depreciation, it adds up. Evie set down the harness, wiped her hands on a rag. Duke and Duchess eat hay I grow myself. Drink water from the well. The only cost is time, and I've got plenty of that. People are going to talk. They already talk. Her smile carried no humor. At least this way I'll give them something worth discussing. Wynne scratched his beard, considering. You're planning to wait them out. I'm planning to survive. When she looked at him, the light through the barn's high windows caught her eyes, turned them sharp. I saw what happens when supply lines fail, Mr. Ashcroft. Saw it in Italy during the war. The trucks stopped running because fuel ran out. The mules kept going. I don't know what's coming, but I know this: if fuel prices double, I'm vulnerable. If they triple, I'm ruined, unless I'm not dependent on fuel at all. And the tractors? Stay right here. Maintained. Ready. Waiting for the moment when I need them. Which is when? When the time is right. She picked up the harness again, tested the straps. Could be next year. Could be 20 years from now. But when it comes, I'll be the only one still standing. Wynne nodded slowly. Your neighbors are going to think you've gone backward. Let them think what they want. Evie's voice held steel beneath the quiet. I'm not farming to impress my neighbors. I'm farming to keep a promise. She meant it. Through 1959, 1960, 1961. While combines grew larger and tractors grew more powerful, and everyone around her expanded their operations on credit, extended by banks, eager to finance progress. Evie worked her 180 acres behind a team of mules that moved at 3 miles per hour and needed no gasoline at all. The savings account stabilized, then grew. She'd calculated income sources beyond the farm because farm income alone wouldn't build the cushion she needed. 5 farmers hired her to keep their books. $2 per hour, roughly 70 hours monthly, brought in an additional $140. She sold eggs and butter and vegetables at the farmers market in Lamar every Saturday, another $60 to $80 weekly during growing season. Her reputation as the finest seamstress in 3 counties brought steady alteration work that added another $50 to $75 monthly. Occasionally, when someone's equipment broke down and they couldn't afford the dealer, they'd call Wynne, and Wynne would bring Evie and she'd diagnose the problem while Wynne pretended to be the expert. That brought anywhere from $20 to $50 per job depending on complexity. Total monthly income averaged across the year came to approximately $650. The farm contributed roughly $350. Side work added $300. Expenses, property tax, electricity, fuel for the truck, food, clothing, school supplies for Judith totaled about $330 monthly. The difference, $320, went into the savings account at Lamar Farmers Bank, $3,840 annually, every year, accumulating. She maintained the tractors religiously. First Saturday of every month, she'd start both engines, let them run for 30 minutes while she checked for leaks and listened for problems. Changed the oil twice yearly, kept fuel tanks full and treated with stabilizer, greased every fitting, tested every system. When something needed attention, she fixed it immediately. The cost averaged about $90 annually, far less than using them daily, would have cost far more than simply letting them sit and rust would have required. Mike Bennett stopped by every spring like clockwork, usually in April when farmers were thinking about planting and equipment dealers pushed their newest models. He'd pull up in his John Deere truck, step out wearing a company jacket and a smile that had started genuine years ago but had curdled into something between confusion and condescension. The conversation followed the same pattern every time. "Morning, Mrs. Whitmore. Got some new models I'd like to show you. The 4020's selling real well. More power, better hydraulics, fully synchronized transmission. Make your work a lot easier." I'm sure it would. Evie never stopped working when he talked. Kept stacking hay bales or cleaning the barn or whatever task needed doing, but I'm managing fine with what I have. What you have is a pair of mules and tractors older than most of the farmers around here. What I have is paid for. She'd pause then, just long enough to meet his eyes. No monthly payments, no interest, no debt. You know what that's worth, Mr. Bennett. Not as much as staying competitive. I'm plenty competitive. I grew 3,000 bushels of corn last year, sold every bit of it, made a profit. Evie would return to her work, signaling the end of the conversation. "When I need new equipment, I'll come see you. Until then, I'm fine." He'd leave frustrated. Come back the next year hoping for a different answer. Find the same woman saying the same thing, a little older each time but no more likely to change her mind than she'd been the year before. The community settled into calling her Mule Evie or Stubborn Widow or that crazy Whitmore woman, depending on who was talking and how charitable they felt. Most of it rolled off her without leaving a mark. Some of it stung particularly when Judith came home from school with stories about classmates who'd heard their parents talking. Judith grew up embarrassed. 8 years old, watching her mother work behind animals while everyone else's fathers, and they were always fathers because widows who remarried became someone else's concern, drove shiny tractors. 10 years old, wearing dresses her mother had sewn from fabric bought on clearance while other girls wore store-bought clothes from Kansas City. 12 years old, learning to drive the mule team because Evie needed help and hired hands cost money better saved. The resentment built slowly, pressure accumulating like steam in a sealed container. Small arguments about nothing important. Why can't we buy a television like everyone else? Why do I have to wear this old coat? Why can't you just be normal? That hid larger questions Judith didn't yet have words for. Preston Kane arrived in her life during her senior year of high school. 25 years old, insurance salesman working for a company based in Springfield, renting a room in Lamar while he built his client list in Barton County. Dark hair slicked back with pomade suits that cost more than Evie spent on clothes in a year, smile that could sell ice to Eskimos, or policies to farmers who didn't need them. He saw Judith at church one Sunday, pretty girl with blonde hair and blue eyes and a desperation to escape that practically radiated from her skin. They started dating in September. Engaged by Christmas. Judith wore a ring with a diamond so small you needed good light to see it, but it was real, and it was hers. And it represented everything she wanted: a life away from mules and poverty, and a mother who refused to join the modern world. Thanksgiving, 1966. Preston came to dinner at the farmhouse, first time meeting Evie properly, though they'd exchanged pleasantries at church and after the engagement announcement. He arrived in a Chevrolet Impala new enough to still smell like the factory, parked it where everyone could see from the kitchen window, wore a suit to a farm dinner, shook Evie's hand with a grip designed to impress rather than connect. The meal proceeded awkwardly. Evie had cooked turkey and all the traditional sides used the good china that had been her grandmother's. Preston complimented everything effusively, the kind of praise that sounded like he was reading from a script. Judith fidgeted, nervous energy making her rearrange silverware and refill water glasses that were still half full. Coffee came after dessert. Evie poured 3 cups, set them on the table, waited. Preston cleared his throat, straightened his tie despite already sitting ramrod perfect. "Mrs. Whitmore, I want to thank you for raising such a wonderful daughter. Judith's told me all about growing up here, about the farm, about how hard you've worked since your husband passed. I did what needed doing, of course, and that's admirable, really admirable." Preston reached across the table, took Judith's hand. "But Judith and I have been talking about our future. about starting our life together. And we think it might be time to consider selling the farm." Evie set her coffee cup down carefully. The silence stretched long enough that Preston shifted in his chair. "The farm is worth, what, 35,000, maybe 40. That's a substantial sum. You could buy a nice house in town, live comfortably, not have to work so hard, and Judith and I could use some help with a down payment on our own place. Nothing large, just enough to get started. Seems like it would benefit everyone. The farm isn't for sale." Preston's smile never wavered, but something behind his eyes hardened. "With respect, Mrs. Whitmore, you're 60 years old. Running this place alone can't be easy. Judith worries about you. We both do. Selling would be sensible. Give you a chance to rest. Enjoy your later years. I'm 49. Evie's voice stayed level. "And I don't need rest. I need to keep the promise I made to my husband." "But your husband is gone." Preston's mask slipped slightly, showing the calculation beneath. "Forgive me for being blunt, but holding on to this place out of sentiment when you could improve your life and help your daughter, that's not loyalty. That's stubbornness." Judith had been staring at her plate. Now her head came up. "Mother, he's right. You don't have to live like this. You don't have to prove anything to anyone. I'm not trying to prove anything." Evie looked at her daughter, saw a stranger wearing a familiar face. "This farm will be yours someday, Judith. If you want to sell it, then that's your choice. But while I'm alive and able, it stays in this family. I don't want it." The words burst out of Judith like they'd been damned too long. "I don't want this farm. I don't want to be here. I want a normal life." Preston squeezed her hand, supportive. "It's okay, honey. She doesn't understand." Evie felt something crack inside her chest. The tone shifted when she spoke again, anger seeping through cracks in her composure. "You think I don't understand wanting more? You think I haven't stood in this kitchen and wondered what life would be like somewhere else? Different choices, easier path. Then why don't you?" "Because your father and I built this together." Evie's voice rose despite her efforts to control it. "Every acre, every improvement, every dollar saved. We had a plan. We were going to pass this to you debt-free, something solid you could build your own life on. He died before we finished, but the plan didn't die with him. I never asked for this." Judith stood chair scraping against wood. "I never asked to be the daughter of the crazy widow who farms with mules. Do you know what people say about us? About you? Do you know how hard it is to go to school, to church, anywhere, and have everyone look at us like we're some kind of joke? Let them look. I can't." Judith's eyes brimmed, but she blinked the tears back, stubborn even in anger. "I can't live like this anymore. I'm marrying Preston. I'm moving to Springfield. And I'm not coming back." Evie absorbed the blow without flinching. "If that's your choice, I respect it. But this farm isn't for sale. Not to help with a down payment. Not for any reason. When you change your mind, I won't. When you change your mind, your room will still be here." Evie stood as well, began clearing dishes with hands that trembled just enough to notice. "Until then, I hope you'll be happy." Preston started to speak, but Judith shook her head. They left within 10 minutes. The Chevrolet's engine started, smooth headlights cutting across the yard as Preston backed out and drove away. Evie stood at the kitchen window watching taillights disappear down the road. Behind her, the table held 3 coffee cups, 2 barely touched. The good china would need washing. The leftovers would need storing. Work that could wait until she stopped shaking. Judith married Preston Kane in February 1967. Small ceremony at a Springfield courthouse, no family present because the only family that mattered had made clear she wouldn't bless the union. They moved into a 2-bedroom apartment on the south side of the city. Preston's insurance career progressed adequately. Judith got a job as a receptionist at a dental office, smiled at patients and scheduled appointments and pretended she'd escaped to something better. 6 years passed. 6 years without a phone call or a letter or a visit. 6 years of Evie farming alone, saving alone, aging alone in a house that echoed with absence. The community watched, waited for her to fail to sell, to finally admit defeat and join the ranks of widows who'd made the sensible choice. She didn't fail. She didn't sell. She kept working, kept saving, kept maintaining those 2 tractors in the barn that nobody except Win Ashcroft knew ran perfectly, despite a decade of sitting idle. And soon, forces beyond her control would prove she'd been right all along. October 6, 1973, a Sunday. The Organization of Arab Petroleum. Exporting countries announced an oil embargo against nations supporting Israel in what the newspapers were calling the Yom Kippur War. The announcement made page 3 of the Kansas City Star. Most people in Barton County didn't notice it at all. 2 weeks later they noticed. Gasoline prices jumped from 36 cents per gallon to 55 cents overnight. Lines formed at service stations before dawn, cars snaking around blocks while drivers waited 2 hours for the privilege of filling their tanks. Diesel followed the same trajectory, 40 cents to 75 cents in less than a month. The spike hit farmers like a fist to the gut, sudden and hard enough to knock the wind out. Garrett Crawford stood in his equipment barn that November, running calculations on paper he'd later burn, because seeing the numbers written down made them real in a way he couldn't stomach. 600 acres required 3 John Deere 402s running full tilt from April through October. Each tractor consumed roughly 12 gallons per working day. Call it 70 working days per season, 210 total across all 3 machines. At the old fuel price, diesel had cost him $4,800 annually. At the new price, that jumped to $9,200. $4,000. Gone. Evaporated into thin air because some countries he'd never visited decided to stop selling oil to countries he'd never thought about. The absurdity of it made his hands shake. His wife Lorraine watched from the barn doorway, arms crossed against the cold. You need to talk to the bank. Get a loan to cover the difference until prices come back down. And if they don't come back down, they will. Lorraine's certainty came from wanting it to be true rather than any actual knowledge. They have to. This is America. We don't run out of fuel. Garrett didn't argue. Just folded the paper and shoved it in his jacket pocket where it would sit until he worked up the nerve to call Harold Peterson and admit he needed help. The feed store in Lamar became a clearinghouse for misery that winter. Farmers gathered daily not because they needed supplies but because they needed company in their suffering. Someone to confirm that yes, this was really happening. Yes, it was as bad as they thought. Yes, they weren't crazy for feeling like the ground had shifted beneath their feet. Dale Morrison lost 60 pounds between October and February, stress eating him from the inside. Luther Hayes started drinking before noon and everyone pretended not to notice. Roger Sullivan sold his truck and bought a used Volkswagen that got better mileage, drove it to the store with his head down, ashamed to be seen in a vehicle that small. They complained about Arabs and politicians and oil companies and every other target they could find. Blamed everyone except themselves for building operations that depended on cheap fuel staying cheap forever. Evie appeared at the feed store on a Wednesday afternoon in mid-December, needing chicken feed for the layers she kept behind the barn. 20 hens producing enough eggs to sell at the farmer's market, income that had become more important now that every dollar mattered. She wore the same work clothes she always wore, denim coveralls, flannel shirt, boots, caked in frozen mud. 58 years old now, hair more silver than white, face weathered to where the wrinkles had wrinkles. 8 men stood near the counter, voices low and tired. The conversation died when she walked in. Not hostile, just acknowledging a presence that didn't quite fit their club of shared suffering. Dale Morrison broke the silence first, attempting friendliness that came out patronizing instead. How you managing Evie? Fuel costs must be rough on everyone. She hefted a 50-pound bag of feed onto her shoulder, carried it toward the truck without obvious effort. I don't use much fuel. The statement landed flat. Nobody knew quite how to respond. Garrett Crawford leaned against a support post, studying her with the expression of a man trying to solve a puzzle he didn't have all the pieces for. What do you mean Duke and Duchess don't need gasoline? Just hay and water. Evie paused at the door, not to gloat but simply to state a fact. My costs haven't changed. She left. The bell over the door chimed her exit. The 8 men looked at each other, pieces finally clicking into place. Roger Sullivan spoke into the silence. She's been planning for this. All those years we laughed at her. She was planning for exactly this. Nobody contradicted him. Win Ashcroft invited Evie to dinner that Saturday, pot roast and potatoes cooked in the small house where he'd lived alone for 20 years. 85 years old now, moving slower than he used to, but still sharp enough to read a room or recognize when history was turning. They ate at a table set for 2, the kind of comfortable silence that came from years of knowing each other well enough that conversation wasn't mandatory. Win broke it over coffee. They're starting to see it now. Some of them, not all. Evie cupped her hands around the mug, drawing warmth. Garrett Crawford still thinks it's temporary. Prices will drop back down. Everything will return to normal. Will they? No. The certainty in her voice came from somewhere deeper than guesswork. This isn't temporary. This is what happens when you build everything on something you don't control. The supply line broke. It'll get fixed eventually, but people will remember. Smart ones anyway. And the others will keep doing what they've always done until it destroys them. Evie sipped her coffee, grimaced at the bitterness. We can't save people from their own choices. Wynne studied her across the table. You're getting ready to make a move. Not yet. But soon. She met his gaze, held it. When the next crisis hits, and there will be a next crisis, that's when opportunity comes. Right now they're all scrambling. Give it a few years. Let them exhaust themselves trying to survive. Then I'll have options they won't. You're a patient woman. I learned from the best. Evie smiled, small and sad. Clayton used to say that farming was 90% waiting. Waiting for the right weather, the right price, the right moment to act. The waiting's the hardest part. but it's also what separates the ones who make it from the ones who don't. They finished their coffee. Wynne walked her to the door, handed her a jar of preserves his daughter-in-law had made. Evie thanked him, drove home through darkness so complete that the stars overhead looked close enough to touch. The embargo ended in March 1974. Gasoline prices didn't return to 36 cents. They settled around 55-60 cents, a new normal that everyone would have called catastrophic 6 months earlier, but now accepted as just how things were. Farmers adjusted, cut costs elsewhere, worked longer hours, borrowed money to cover shortfalls. Evie's savings account grew. August brought heat that shimmered off asphalt and turned the farmhouse into an oven by mid-afternoon. Evie worked in the garden behind the house, pulling weeds from between tomato plants, heavy with fruit, not quite ripe enough to pick. 4 o'clock sun still high, sweat soaking through her shirt despite the bandana she'd wrapped around her forehead. A car engine. Unfamiliar sound, not the steady rumble of trucks and tractors, but something lighter, higher-pitched. Evie straightened, shading her eyes against the glare. A Chevrolet Nova Blue with rust eating the wheel wells pulled into the yard and stopped. The engine died. The driver's door opened. Judith stepped out. 27 years old now, thinner than Evie remembered, wearing a sundress that had seen better days and sandals held together with duct tape. Her blonde hair hung limp, unwashed for days. Dark circles under eyes that had always been bright now looked hollow, haunted. She reached into the back seat and lifted a child. The girl looked maybe 2-3 at most. Blonde hair and pigtails tied with ribbons starting to fray. Face round, an innocent thumb in her mouth, head resting on Judith's shoulder with the complete trust that only very young children possess. Evie set down her trowel. Walked across the yard, dirt still clinging to her knees. Heart doing something complicated in her chest that felt like breaking and mending simultaneously. Judith's voice came out rough, scraped raw. "Mom, I didn't know where else to go." "Inside." Evie gestured toward the house. "It's too hot to talk out here." The kitchen felt marginally cooler, windows open to catch whatever breeze existed. Evie poured water from the pitcher she kept in the refrigerator, set glasses on the table. Judith settled the child in her lap. The girl stared at Evie with solemn curiosity, studying this stranger who looked like Mama, but older. "This is Amelia." Judith's hand smoothed her daughter's hair, automatic gesture of comfort. "She's 2.5, born February of 72. Evie absorbed the information. Calculated backward. Conceived within months of the wedding, which explained why Preston had been so eager to marry quickly. "She's beautiful. Thank you." Judith's composure cracked slightly. Tears starting but held back through what looked like sheer force of will. "Preston left us 3 months ago, ran off with a girl from his office. 22 years old, no kids. Everything I'm not anymore." The words tumbled out then. Damn breaking. How she'd been working as a receptionist, how the money was never quite enough, how Preston spent more than they made and expected her to manage anyway, how the arguments escalated from weekly to daily to constant, how she'd come home from work one Thursday to find half their furniture gone, Preston's clothes gone, bank account empty except for $17 and change. "I've been waitressing at a diner in Springfield. Tips aren't bad, but childcare costs almost as much as I make." Judith wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "I can't keep doing this. I'm so tired, Mom. I'm so tired and I don't know what else to do." Evie reached across the table, covered her daughter's hand with her own. "You come home, both of you. This house has plenty of room. I can't ask you to." "You're not asking. I'm telling." Evie squeezed gently. "Your room is exactly how you left it. We'll set up the spare bedroom for Amelia. You can help with the farm or not, whatever you're able to manage. But you're home now. That's all that matters." Judith broke, then crying in a way she probably hadn't allowed herself to cry in months. Big gasping sobs that shook her whole body while Amelia patted her mother's face, confused but trying to help. Evie stood, moved around the table, wrapped both of them in arms that had grown strong from a decade of work that would have broken softer people. Later, after Judith cried herself out and Amelia fell asleep on the couch and the worst of the heat began to fade with approaching evening, they sat on the porch and talked. "How did you do it?" Judith's voice carried genuine curiosity beneath the exhaustion. "Stay here alone with everyone mocking you. How did you not just give up? Because giving up would mean your father died for nothing." Evie rocked slowly in the chair Clayton had built 30 years earlier, wood-worn smooth by decades of use. "We had a plan. He didn't get to see it finished, but that doesn't mean the plan was wrong. It just means I had to finish it alone. Everyone thought you were crazy. Everyone thought what they thought. Couldn't change it, so I stopped trying." Evie looked out across fields where corn stood shoulder-high, green and healthy, despite the drought that had hit neighboring counties. "The land doesn't care what people think. It just needs someone willing to do the work." "I was so stupid." Judith's hands twisted in her lap. "I married Preston because I was ashamed of you. Of us. of being different. You married him because you were 18 and wanted something different than what you had. That's not stupid, that's just young. Evie's tone gentled. You came back. That takes more courage than leaving ever did. They sat in silence as the sun dropped toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that would have been beautiful if either of them had been in the mood to appreciate it. The next morning, Judith woke early out of habit, found her mother already up, coffee-made breakfast half prepared. They moved around the kitchen in a dance that felt familiar despite 6 years of separation, each anticipating where the other would be, what needed doing next. Amelia appeared an hour later, sleepy and confused, but adapting with the resilience of children who don't yet understand that major life changes require more processing than deciding what to have for breakfast. After the meal, Judith helped clear dishes while Amelia colored at the table with crayons Evie produced from somewhere. The conversation drifted to practical matters, where things were kept, what the daily routine looked like, what help Evie actually needed versus what she'd accept. I need to show you something. Evie dried her hands on a dish towel. Come with me. They walked to the barn, Amelia trailing behind, chattering to herself in that half-language of toddlers, where real words mixed with sounds that meant something only to the speaker. Evie pulled open the heavy door, stepped inside where morning light filtered through gaps in the boards and dust motes danced in the beams. She walked to the far corner where two massive shapes sat under canvas tarps gone gray with accumulated dust. Grabbed the edge of the first tarp, pulled it free in one smooth motion. Underneath sat the Farmall M red paint, still bright, despite nearly 3 decades, chrome exhaust pipe, gleaming tires inflated to proper pressure, everything exactly as it had been the last time Clayton drove it. Judith stared. You have a tractor. Her voice climbed half an octave. You've had a tractor this whole time. 2, actually. Evie moved to the second tarp, revealed the Farmall 400 in equally pristine condition. Your father bought the first one in 1947, the second in 54. I've maintained them ever since. But why? Judith circled the 400, running her hand along the fender, touching it like she needed physical confirmation of its existence. Why use mules when you have these? Because I was waiting. Evie leaned against the barn wall, arms crossed. These tractors run on fuel I have to buy from people I don't control at prices I can't predict, using supply chains that can break any time someone in a country I've never heard of decides to stop selling. Duke and Duchess run on hay that grows in my own field and water from my own well. As long as I have those, I can farm. As long as I can farm, I can survive. The understanding that crossed Judith's face came slow but complete. The oil crisis. You knew something like that would happen. Didn't know. Just prepared for the possibility. Evie pushed off from the wall, walked to the Farmall M, patted its hood like greeting an old friend. These have been waiting 26 years for the right moment. When that moment comes, I'll be the only farmer in this county with working equipment and no debt to pay off. When will that be? Soon. Evie's smile carried weight. Very soon. The years between 1974 and 1979 passed in a rhythm that felt almost normal. Judith settled into farm life with surprising ease, helping with bookkeeping and managing the farmers' market sales, and generally making herself useful in ways that freed Evie to focus on field work. Amelia grew from toddler to child, running through the house and playing in the barn and learning that chores were non-negotiable even if you were only 6 years old. The oil embargo's effects lingered. Fuel prices stabilized but never dropped back to pre-crisis levels. Farmers who'd expanded aggressively in the late 60s found themselves squeezed between higher operating costs and grain prices that hadn't risen proportionally. Some cut back, some borrowed more, some started looking at their land and doing math that made their stomachs hurt. Evie watched, waited, kept saving. January 1979 brought news from Iran that most people initially dismissed as someone else's problem happening somewhere far away. The Shah fled. Ayatollah Khomeini took power. Oil production in the Persian Gulf collapsed. By summer, gasoline prices had tripled. 90 cents a gallon in June, $1.20 in August, $1.65 by October. Diesel followed the same trajectory, climbing from 90 cents to $1.50 in less than 6 months. The economy convulsed. Inflation hit double digits. Interest rates climbed higher than anyone under 40 had ever seen. The word recession appeared in newspapers daily, though some economists whispered depression when they thought nobody was listening. For farmers operating on thin margins and heavy debt, the second crisis hit like a sledgehammer following the rock that had already cracked their foundation. Equipment payments didn't care that fuel suddenly cost 3 times more. Bank loans didn't adjust because crop prices lagged behind inflation. The math that had made sense 5 years ago became impossible. Garrett Crawford's world collapsed across the summer and fall of '79. The 3 John Deere 402s that had seemed like smart investments in '73 now looked like anchors dragging him under. Fuel costs hit $19,000 annually. Equipment payments added another $12,000. Operating loans carried interest at 15%. The grain he harvested in October sold for prices barely higher than they'd been 5 years earlier, while everything he needed to produce it cost twice as much. He sat in his equipment barn on a Saturday night in November, whiskey bottle 3/4 empty, adding numbers that refused to balance no matter how many times he recalculated. Total debt, $267,000. Annual income, assuming normal yields and current prices, maybe $100,000. Operating costs, fuel payments, everything $140,000 minimum. The difference $40,000 in the red year after year, compounding. His wife Lorraine had left in September. Took their 3 kids to her sister's place in Kansas City, said she couldn't watch him destroy himself and them alongside. Called once a week to check if he'd come to his senses yet. He didn't know what senses she meant. Couldn't see any choice that led somewhere better. The bar in Lamar stayed open until midnight on weekends, serving a clientele that had grown steadily more desperate as the year progressed. Farmers who used to drink for pleasure now drank for oblivion, seeking a few hours where the numbers stopped adding themselves up behind their eyes. Garrett sat alone in a corner booth back to the wall, 3 empty beer bottles forming a triangle on the scarred wood table. Saturday night, late August heat that hadn't broken despite the sun going down hours ago. The bar's air conditioning had quit working in July, and the owner couldn't afford to fix it, so everyone sweated and pretended not to notice. The door opened. Evie walked in. She stood in the entrance for a moment, letting her eyes adjust to the dim interior, scanning the room until she located what she'd come for. Moved through the bar with purpose, ignoring stares from men who couldn't quite process why a 64-year-old woman would enter a place like this alone at 10:30 on a Saturday night. She slid into the booth across from Garrett without asking permission. He looked up, took a moment to focus, managed something between a laugh and a sob. "Come to gloat, mule Evie? Come to tell me you were right?" "No. Came to make you an offer." Her hands rested on the table, calloused and steady. "I want to buy 200 acres from you." The words took several seconds to penetrate the alcohol fog. When they did, Garrett's expression shifted through confusion to understanding to bitter amusement. "And how would you pay for that? You've been farming with mules for 20 years. Can't have much money. $220 per acre. That's $44,000. Cash?" Evie's voice carried no triumph, no satisfaction, just business. "It's a fair price. More than fair, actually, given current market conditions. You don't have that kind of money. I've been saving for 31 years. Every dollar I didn't spend on fuel. Every dollar I didn't borrow. Every dollar I didn't waste trying to impress people who didn't matter." Evie leaned forward slightly. "I have the money, Garrett. Question is whether you're ready to sell." He stared at her, really seeing her for maybe the first time in 2 decades. Saw the gray hair and the weathered face and the hands that showed every year of work without complaint. Saw someone who'd been right when everyone else was wrong and who'd paid the price for being different, but paid it anyway because being right mattered more than being liked. "You planned this." The accusation came without heat. "All those years, you were waiting for us to fail. I planned to survive. What happened to others I didn't control and don't celebrate." Evie's expression softened marginally. "You fed a family of 5 on those 600 acres. You did what made sense at the time. The world changed. That's not your fault. But you knew it would change. I knew something would. Didn't know what, didn't know when. Just knew that depending on fuel I couldn't control meant vulnerability I couldn't afford. So I built a different kind of operation. Slower, smaller, but mine." Evie paused. "The offer stands for 30 days. Think about it. Talk to Lorraine. If you want to sell, call me. If not, I'll find land somewhere else." She stood, walked out. Left Garrett sitting with his empty bottles and his impossible math and the first real hope he'd felt in months that maybe, just maybe, he could stop the bleeding before it killed him. Harold Peterson had aged into his late 70s believing he understood how money worked. 45 years in banking, watching fortunes made and lost, loans repaid and defaulted, had given him certainty about who would succeed and who would fail. Evelyn Whitmore's appearance in his office on a Tuesday morning in September shook that certainty down to bedrock. She sat across from his desk, same chair she'd occupied 24 years earlier when he'd told her to sell. Looked older now, obviously, but also somehow more solid, like time had compressed her rather than eroded her. She placed a bank book on the desk between them. Harold opened it. The number at the bottom of the most recent page made him blink, check again to confirm he'd read correctly. $78,000. "Where did this come from? I saved it." Evie's voice held no pride, just fact. "Every year since Clayton died. Sometimes more, sometimes less, but always something. Added up." Harold removed his glasses, set them beside the bank book, rubbed his eyes like a man hoping the world would rearrange itself into something more recognizable when he looked again. "Mrs. Whitmore." "Evelyn. I owe you an apology. You don't owe me anything. We had different opinions about what made sense. You were looking out for the bank's interests. I was looking out for mine. 24 years ago I told you to sell. I thought you'd fail within 2 years. I was—" Harold paused, searching for words adequate to the moment. "I was wrong. Profoundly wrong. And I'm sorry. You weren't wrong to think most widows would fail. Most did." Evie reached across, reclaimed the bank book. "I survived because I wasn't trying to prove anything, just trying to keep a promise. To your husband. To myself." She met his eyes, held them. That I could control my own fate. That I wouldn't be dependent on systems I couldn't influence or trust. That I'd leave something solid for Judith. Harold glanced at the withdrawal slip she'd placed beside the bank book. $44,000 to Garrett Crawford's loan account. The South Quarter. Yes. My land borders his on the east side, adding that 200 acres gives me 380 total, manageable size for what I have in mind, which is— Evie smiled, small and private. "You'll see. The transaction completed within a week. Paperwork signed, funds transferred, deed recorded at the county courthouse. Evie added 200 acres to her operation, and Garrett Crawford bought himself breathing room, not salvation, but time to figure out whether salvation existed anywhere in his future." The news spread through Barton County like water, finding cracks seeping into every conversation at the feed store and the diner and the church. Evelyn Whitmore, the crazy widow who farmed with mules, had just bought 200 acres with cash while everyone else scrambled to make loan payments. The cognitive dissonance hurt people's brains, forced them to reevaluate assumptions they'd held for decades about what constituted smart farming and who deserved respect. Mike Bennett heard about it from 3 different sources before noon on the day the deed transferred. By evening he'd decided what needed doing. By the next morning he'd worked up the nerve to do it. Spring of 1980 brought his dealership's death throes. John Deere had warned him the franchise was at risk if sales didn't improve. Sales hadn't improved. Couldn't improve when nobody could afford new equipment, and the used equipment glutting the market sold for pennies on the dollar. The company sent a letter in April giving him 90 days to meet quota or close. He didn't meet quota. Saturday morning in early June, Mike drove his personal truck out to Evie's farm. The John Deere company vehicle sat in the dealership lot, keys on the desk, title signed over to corporate. Everything else, the showroom, the parts inventory, the service bays, belonged to them now. He belonged to nothing except whatever came next. Evie worked in the barn, crouched beside the Farmall 400 grease gun in one hand, checking every fitting the way Win Ashcroft had taught her decades earlier. She heard the truck, glanced up, recognized Mike. Despite the changes, stress had carved into his features. 55 years old now, hair more gray than brown, shoulders hunched forward like he'd learned to expect the next blow and wanted to protect vital organs. "Mrs. Whitmore." Mike stopped at the barn entrance, unsure whether to come further without invitation. "I owe you an apology." She stood, wiped her hands on a rag, studied him. "For what, 15 years? I spent 15 years trying to convince you to buy equipment you didn't need. Told you that mules were backward, that you had to modernize, that refusing to change meant refusing to succeed." Mike's voice carried the weight of every assumption he'd been forced to dismantle. "I was wrong. About everything. You were doing your job, selling tractors. Nothing wrong with that. No, I was doing more than that. I was judging you, thinking you were stuck in the past, afraid of progress." Mike looked past her to where the Farmall 400 sat, maintained to showroom condition, despite being 26 years old. "Turns out you weren't afraid of progress. You just understood something I didn't. Which was that debt is a cage. That depending on fuel you don't control means vulnerability you can't afford. That slow and steady beats fast, and leveraged every single time." Mike's laugh came bitter. "I learned it too late to save my business, but at least I learned it." Evie considered him, this man who'd represented everything she'd rejected, now standing in her barn looking lost. "I'm expanding to 380 acres. Need help managing the equipment. Both tractors will run full-time now, which means maintenance, repairs, all the technical work I'm good at but takes time away from farming. You're offering me a job. Partnership. $900 a month plus 8% of net profits." Evie's tone stayed matter-of-fact. "You understand equipment better than anyone in this county. I understand farming without debt. Seems like we could help each other." Mike stood silent for several seconds, processing. Finally, "Why would you do that?" "After everything I said about you, because you're learning. And because I need someone who knows modern equipment when I start using it properly." Evie moved to the Farmall M, patted its fender. "These have been waiting almost 30 years. Time to put them to work. What about Duke and Duchess retired to pasture? They earned it." Her smile held genuine affection. "Taught me everything I needed to know about patience. Now it's time for the lesson's second half." Mike accepted. started the following Monday, moving into the small cottage on Evie's property that had once housed a farm manager back when her father-in-law ran the place. Judith handled the paperwork, setting up the partnership as a legal entity that protected both parties while allowing the flexibility they'd need. The community watched this development with the same bewildered fascination they'd shown at the land purchase. Evie Whitmore, who everyone had written off as crazy, now employed the former John Deere dealer and ran an operation growing larger while everyone else's shrank. The narrative required adjustment. People started using different words when they talked about her. Shrewd, forward-thinking, patient. Evie ignored the changing perceptions, the same way she'd ignored the original mockery. Just kept working. Between 1980 and 83, while the farm crisis deepened and banks across the Midwest foreclosed on operations that had survived generations, Evie added land twice more. Vernon Tucker retired at 78. No children to inherit, sold her 100 acres in January of 81 for $18,000. Henry Walsh died in August of 82. Widow sold the 80 acres adjoining Evie's western border for $15,000. By autumn of 83, Evie owned 460 acres, employed Mike Bennett, and 2 day laborers full-time, ran both farmalls, and had begun discussing with Mike whether a third tractor made sense. The Kansas City Star sent a reporter in November of 82, young woman fresh out of journalism school, looking for human interest stories in the farm crisis. Spent 2 days following Evie around, notebook always out, asking questions that got closer to the truth than most people managed. The article ran on page 1 of the Sunday Business section. Headline read, "The Widow Who Waited: How One Woman Outsmarted the Farm Crisis." 3,000 words detailing Evie's strategy, her military background, the decision to use mules while maintaining tractors in secret, the patience that let her buy land when others were losing it. The reporter had captured one quote that would follow Evie for the rest of her life, appeared in later articles, and eventually on a plaque in the Missouri Agriculture Hall of Fame. The paper printed it in a call-out box, larger font, impossible to miss. "I didn't outsmart anyone. I just remembered what the Army taught me. The person who controls their supply line survives the longest." Win Ashcroft died on a Tuesday night in December of 83, peaceful in his sleep at 98 years old. His daughter-in-law found him the next morning, already cold, expression serene. The funeral drew half the county, people paying respects to a man who'd farmed the same land for 60 years before retiring and who'd spent his retirement teaching anyone willing to learn. Evie stood at the graveside while the preacher said words about dust and resurrection and eternal rest. Judith beside her, Amelia 11, now growing tall and serious, holding her mother's hand. When the service ended and people began drifting toward their cars, Evie remained. The funeral director approached, handed her an envelope. "Mr. Ashcroft left instructions. This is for you." Inside, a handwritten note on paper gone brittle with age, dated 6 months earlier. "Evie, if you're reading this, I finally wore out. Good run, all things considered. I'm leaving you $6,000 from my savings. Use it however makes sense. Buy more land, fix something that breaks, set it aside for Amelia's education. Your judgment's better than mine ever was. More important, I'm leaving you the knowledge that you made an old man's last years worth living. Watching you prove everyone wrong. Watching you build something that'll last. That gave me hope. The world still has room for people who think past next quarter's profits. Keep those tractors running. Not because they're special machines, but because they represent something that matters. Patience. Planning. The willingness to wait for the right moment instead of forcing the wrong one. You've taught this county more than they'll admit. Maybe more than they know. But they're learning. Slowly, but learning. Win. P.S. Don't get sentimental over me. I lived exactly as long as I wanted, and died owing nothing to nobody. Can't ask better than that." Evie folded the letter, tucked it in her coat pocket, stood at the grave until Judith touched her elbow. Gentle reminder that they should go. She nodded, let herself be guided to the truck, sat in the passenger seat while Judith drove because she didn't trust herself behind the wheel just yet. That night, after Amelia went to bed and Judith retired to her room, Evie sat at the kitchen table with the letter spread before her and cried for the first time since Clayton's funeral. Not loud, not dramatic, just tears running down weathered cheeks while she reread Win's words and mourned the loss of the last person who'd believed in her from the beginning. The money went into Amelia's education fund. The lesson went into Evie's bones, already there, but reinforced that patience wasn't passive, wasn't just waiting for something to happen. Patience was active preparation for the moment when waiting ended and action began. Win had understood that, had seen it in her when everyone else saw only stubbornness. The world kept turning. The farm crisis continued grinding through the Midwest, destroying operations that had survived depressions and droughts and every other catastrophe agriculture threw at them. But Evie's operation grew slowly and carefully, always within the bounds of what she could manage without borrowing, always building on the foundation she and Clayton had started 40 years earlier. 460 acres, no debt, 2 tractors running perfectly. Mike Bennett managing equipment while Judith managed books, and Amelia learned that farming meant work, but also meant belonging to something larger than yourself. And somewhere in a cemetery behind First Baptist Church, 2 men rested under Missouri soil, one who'd started the journey, one who'd guided it through its hardest years. Both would have been proud of how far she'd come. Both would have told her she had further to go. Spring of 1985 brought opportunity in the form of tragedy. Vernon Tucker collapsed while feeding cattle on a February morning heart attack, massive enough that he died before the ambulance arrived from Lamar. 81 years old, widowed, 15 years, no children to inherit the 140 acres he'd farmed since before the Depression. His sister's family in Iowa wanted nothing to do with Missouri dirt. The estate lawyer called Evie before listing the property publicly. She walked the land on a Saturday, Judith and Mike trailing behind while Amelia, 13, now long-legged and curious, ranged ahead, examining fence lines and drainage patterns with the eye of someone learning to see what mattered. Good soil, mostly level, adjoining Evie's eastern border in a way that would simplify equipment movement and crop rotation. Tucker had let maintenance slide in his final years, fences sagging and one barn roof missing shingles, but nothing that couldn't be fixed. The price came to $240 per acre, $33,600. Evie countered at $230. The lawyer accepted within an hour. Closing happened in Harold Peterson's office, now run by his son David, because Harold had finally retired at 79. David had the same careful manner as his father, but lacked the certainty that came from never being proven catastrophically wrong. He processed the paperwork with quiet efficiency, watching Evie write a check for the full amount without blinking. "That's 520 acres now, Mrs. Whitmore." David stamped the final document, slid it across his desk. "Largest woman-owned farm in Barton County. Probably largest in 3 counties. Just means more work." Evie folded the deed, tucked it in her purse. Her voice carried no pride, no satisfaction, just acknowledgement of fact. 520 acres is manageable with good help and smart planning. Anything more would stretch us too thin. "You planning to expand further?" "Not unless the right opportunity comes at the right time." She stood, smoothed her skirt. She wore dresses to business meetings, now concession to expectations that cost nothing, and bought small courtesies that sometimes mattered. "For now, we focus on what we have." Mike had the equipment situation mapped out before they left the bank. 520 acres meant running both Farmalls, plus the newer John Deere 4020 Evie had purchased, used in '83, bought from an estate sale for $12,000 when comparable models sold new for $40,000. 3 tractors, 2 full-time workers besides himself, seasonal help during planting and harvest. The math worked if crop prices stayed stable and nothing catastrophic happened. Nothing catastrophic happened. 1986 passed in the rhythm that good farming years follow: early planting, adequate rain, warm summer without excessive heat, harvest that yielded slightly above average. Evie turned 71 in October, marked the occasion by replacing the farmhouse roof that had needed attention for 5 years, spent $8,000, and didn't regret a penny. The house would outlast her, needed to be sound for whoever came next. Judith met Fletcher Morrison at a farm equipment auction in Nevada, Missouri, March of '87. Both bidding on the same cultivator, neither willing to quit until the price climbed past reasonable into stubborn. Fletcher won at $200 over fair value, turned to see who'd pushed him that high. Found a 40-year-old woman with her mother's blue eyes and a calculating expression that said she'd let him win because she'd spotted a better deal 3 lots down. They talked after the auction. Fletcher, 42, widowed, 3 years, 2 kids, being raised by his sister because he worked 16-hour days and couldn't manage parenting alone. Owned 200 acres southeast of Lamar, ran cattle alongside grain-steady operation that survived the crisis through conservative management and good luck. White hair going silver, early hands scarred from barbed wire, and machinery voice that carried the weight of someone who'd learned that life gives no guarantees. He asked if she wanted coffee. She said yes. They sat in a diner that smelled like grease and burnt coffee, talked for 2 hours about crop rotation and commodity prices, and whether the farm bill Congress was debating would help or hurt operations their size. Didn't talk about dead spouses or lonely houses or what it meant to wake up every morning and choose to keep going when giving up would be easier. That came later. Took 6 months of careful dating, dinners in public places, church together on Sundays, slow building of trust between 2 people who'd been burned by love's sharp edges and weren't eager to touch fire again. Fletcher met Amelia in May, 14 years old and protective of her mother in ways that made Fletcher respect rather than resent her wariness. Met Evie in June, grandmother who studied him like she was evaluating livestock and asked questions that cut straight to character. They married in November. Small ceremony at First Baptist reception in the church basement with cake. Judith baked herself and coffee in the percolator that had served 1,000 similar gatherings. Fletcher's kids 9 and 11, boy and girl, both stood awkward in their Sunday clothes, not sure what to make of suddenly having a stepmother and step-grandmother and stepsister. Amelia helped them feel welcome, that natural kindness that comes from remembering what it felt like to be young and uncertain. Fletcher moved his operation onto Evie's land rather than trying to combine properties. Made sense logistically and emotionally. Evie's farmhouse was larger equipment, better maintained, soil quality higher. His 200 acres got folded into the overall management, leased back to him at favorable rates that gave him independence while contributing to the whole. The arrangement worked because everyone involved put the work ahead of ego. Amelia turned 16 in '88. She'd grown tall like her grandfather Clayton, 5'9", with blonde hair she kept in a single braid down her back. Athletic from years of farm work, comfortable with machinery in ways that came from growing up around it rather than learning it late. Smart 2 straight A's scholarship offers from 3 universities, future that could go anywhere she wanted. Evie found her in the barn one Saturday afternoon in March, senior year of high school, sitting on the Farmall M's fender and staring at college brochures spread across the tractor's hood. "You look troubled." Amelia glanced up, expression complicated. "I got into Mizzou. Agricultural economics program. Full ride. That's wonderful. So why the long face?" "Because I don't know if I want to leave." Amelia gestured at the brochures at the barn, at everything beyond. "This is home. The farm is home. What if I go to college and lose that?" Evie climbed up beside her joints, protesting the movement but not enough to stop it. "You won't lose it. This land will be here when you get back. If you get back. What if I don't want to come back?" "Then you don't." Evie's voice carried certainty. "I didn't keep this farm so you'd feel obligated to continue it. I kept it so you'd have choices. If farming is your choice, wonderful. If not, also wonderful. Either way, you decide based on what you want, not what you think I expect." "What do you expect?" "That you'll be brave enough to be different if different is what you need to be." Evie touched her granddaughter's hand, brief and warm. "Being different isn't about farming or not farming. It's about choosing your path and walking it even when people say you shouldn't. Everything else is just details." Amelia left for Columbia in August, full scholarship covering tuition and room and board, work study job in the agricultural economics department, adding spending money. Came home for Thanksgiving and Christmas and occasional weekends when homesickness outweighed the cost of gas. Thrived in ways that made Evie proud. Dean's List every semester, research assistant position by sophomore year, understanding of markets and policies that would have taken Evie decades to develop through trial and error. The farm continued without her. Judith and Fletcher managed day-to-day operations while Mike handled equipment, and Evie made the decisions that required 4 decades of experience to get right. 520 acres produced consistently profits, modest but steady savings account growing, even as Evie spent more on maintenance and improvements that increased long-term value. January of 1990 brought a conversation Evie had been avoiding for years. 75 years old now, slowing down in ways that couldn't be denied even by someone as stubborn as her. The work that had taken 6 hours a decade ago now took 8. The cold bothered her more, settling into joints and making mornings difficult until she'd moved enough to work the stiffness out. Nothing catastrophic, just age accumulating the way it does, changing what's possible, one small increment at a time. Judith found her in the office small room off the kitchen where Evie kept ledgers and tax records and 40 years of accumulated paperwork. Late afternoon, winter light fading early, Evie squinting at numbers that refused to add up correctly until she realized she'd been looking at the wrong column. "Mom, we need to talk about the future. We're talking about it right now, aren't we?" Evie set down her pencil, leaned back in the chair that had been Clayton's before it was hers. "I mean the farm. What happens when you can't run it anymore? When I can't run it, you run it. You and Fletcher. We've discussed this. We've discussed it in theory." Judith pulled up the spare chair, sat close enough that her mother couldn't avoid the conversation. "I'm saying we need to discuss it in practice. Financial arrangements, decision-making authority, what gets sold and what doesn't, all the details that matter when the transition actually happens." Evie studied her daughter, seeing traces of Clayton in the set of her jaw, traces of herself in the unwillingness to dance around difficult topics. "You're right. Past time, actually. What do you need to know?" They spent the next 3 hours going through everything. Bank accounts, property deeds, equipment titles, informal agreements with neighbors about shared equipment use or boundary maintenance. Evie had organized it well, decades of military-trained precision showing in how she'd documented every transaction and decision. But organization only mattered if someone else could navigate it. There's one more account. Evie pulled a bank book from the locked drawer in the desk's lower right corner. Different bank. Nevada, Missouri. I don't talk about it because I don't want people knowing how much is there. Judith opened it, stared at the balance, closed it, opened it again to confirm she'd read correctly. Mom, this is $187,000. Clayton had life insurance. $25,000 when he died. I put it in this account and never touched it. Evie's voice stayed matter-of-fact. Conservative investments, mostly bonds, steady growth over 35 years. Compound interest is a remarkable thing when you let it work long enough. Why didn't you use it? For the farm, for equipment, because we didn't need it. The other account covered operations. This was insurance against catastrophe. Evie took the book back, set it on the desk between them. Also wanted to make sure you had something substantial. Not just land, which can be taken or lost, but actual money. Flexibility for whatever comes. Judith's eyes filled, but she blinked the tears back, keeping control the way her mother had taught by example, if not by instruction. What do you want me to do with it? That's for you to decide, when the time comes. Could put it toward Amelia's future, establish a trust, donate it, spend it on something frivolous. Evie's smile carried warmth beneath the practical exterior. I kept my promises, held on to the land, stayed solvent, left you better off than I started. What you do next is your story, not mine. The conversation marked a shift, not dramatic, not a single moment where everything changed, but a gradual transferring of responsibility from mother to daughter. Judith started making more decisions. Evie started deferring to those decisions, trusting that the woman who'd come back, broken from a failed marriage, had grown into someone capable of managing what came next. Summer of '92 brought recognition that felt both overdue and somehow excessive. The Missouri Farm Bureau organization representing agricultural interests across the state announced its Outstanding Woman Farmer Award would go to Evelyn Whitmore of Barton County. Letter arrived in June, formal invitation to a ceremony in Jefferson City, opportunity to address the state's largest gathering of agricultural professionals. Evie's first instinct was declining. Didn't need recognition, didn't want the attention, preferred letting her work speak rather than speaking about her work. Judith and Amelia, home for summer between junior and senior year, tag-teamed her until resistance crumbled. You earned this. Judith stood firm the way she'd learned from watching her mother stand firm against every pressure to quit or sell or give up. You spent 40 years proving everyone wrong. Let them acknowledge it publicly. The ceremony happened on a Saturday in September, ballroom in a hotel near the state capitol, 300 people attending. Evie wore a navy dress Judith had helped pick out, modest but appropriate, nothing that would make her feel like she was playing a part instead of being herself. 77 years old, white hair styled professionally for the first time in maybe ever, hands that showed every year of work and which she refused to hide with gloves or embarrassment. The awards program ran 90 minutes, recognizing achievement in various categories: innovation, conservation, youth development, community leadership. Evie's category came last, most prestigious presenter laying out her story in language that made it sound almost mythic. Widow who refused to quit. Mules when everyone used tractors. Patient accumulation of land while others lost theirs. Operation that survived 2 oil crises and the worst farm economy since the Depression. Evie walked to the podium, accepted the plaque, faced an audience that represented the agricultural establishment she'd spent decades existing outside of. Expected to say thank you and sit down. Spoke instead for 3 minutes that felt simultaneously longer and shorter than they were. I'm grateful for this recognition. Truly. But I want to be clear about something. Her voice carried to the back of the room, steady and strong. I'm not outstanding. I didn't do anything special. I just didn't quit when quitting would have been easier. Slight pause while she gathered the next thought, organized it the way Win Ashcroft had taught her to organize maintenance schedules, logically, practically, without excess. I had people who believed in me. My husband Clayton, who started the plan we didn't finish together. My neighbor, Win Ashcroft, who taught me that patience and preparation beat speed and leverage every time. My daughter Judith, who came home when she could have stayed away and who now runs the operation better than I ever did. Another pause. The room had gone completely silent, audience leaning forward slightly, sensing she had more to say, and it mattered. And I had Duke and Duchess. 2 mules who didn't care that I was a woman trying to farm alone. They just wanted their hay and water and someone who knew how to guide a plow in a straight line. Evie's smile appeared small but genuine. Don't admire me for being different. Admire the people and the animals who supported me when I was. They made this possible. I just showed up and did the work. She sat down to applause that built slowly, started with a few people and spread until the entire room was standing, clapping, not just for her, but for every farmer who'd survived against odds that should have crushed them. Evie endured it with grace, uncomfortable, but understanding that sometimes ceremony mattered for reasons beyond the person being honored. The plaque went on a shelf in the office. The recognition changed how people talked about her, less the crazy widow, more the pioneering woman farmer. Evie noticed the shift without caring much about it. 40 years of not worrying what people thought couldn't be undone by a few people deciding to think differently. Mike Bennett's memoir appeared in spring of '94, self-published through a regional press that specialized in agricultural history and rural Americana. Learning from Evie. What a Widow with Mules Taught Me About Patience. 200 pages, half devoted to Evie's story, half to lessons Mike had extracted about debt and dependency, and the courage it took to choose differently than everyone around you. He gave Evie the first copy straight off the press-dedicated page, reading for Evelyn Whitmore, who taught me that being right matters less than being ready. She read it over a weekend, cover-to-cover, coffee going cold at her elbow, while she absorbed Mike's version of events she'd lived but never quite seen from outside her own perspective. He'd made her sound wiser than she felt, more certain of outcomes that had often seemed desperately uncertain at the time. But he'd also captured something true, that choosing to be different required believing the difference mattered even when evidence suggested otherwise. "You made me sound noble." Evie handed the book back Monday morning. "I wasn't noble, just stubborn. Same thing sometimes." Mike grinned, the easy expression of someone who'd found peace with past failures. "Book's selling pretty well. Regional interest couple agriculture magazines want to interview you." "I don't want interviews." "Figured you'd say that." Mike tucked the book under his arm. "I'll handle press. You keep farming. Deal, deal." The book brought attention Evie didn't seek and couldn't entirely avoid. Articles in farm journals. Speaking invitations she declined. Letters from farmers, mostly women, some men asking advice about how to survive when everything seemed designed to make survival impossible. Evie answered what she could, brief notes acknowledging their situations and offering the only wisdom she had. Control what you can. Prepare for what you can't. Don't mistake speed for progress. PBS found her through Mike's book. Documentary series on women in American agriculture, producers looking for compelling stories that broke stereotypes without feeling preachy about it. They called in January of '95, pitched the concept, asked if she'd participate. Evie said no twice before Amelia convinced her. "Grandma, you're not doing this for yourself. Do it for the women who need to know it's possible." Amelia, 23, now senior year at Mizzou, carried herself with the confidence that came from excelling in environments that hadn't been designed for women like her. "You proved something that matters. Let other people learn from it." The filming took 3 days, spread across late spring. Camera crew of 4, director, who asked thoughtful questions instead of trying to force predetermined answers, hours of footage that would eventually become a 15-minute segment in a larger documentary. They filmed her working, not staged, just following her through actual tasks. Filmed the barn, with both farmalls still maintained, still functional. Filmed interviews with Mike and Judith and several farmers who admitted they'd mocked her decades earlier and had been proven wrong. One quote from Evie became the segment's closing line, appeared in promotional materials, got repeated in reviews and discussions. The director had asked about facing dismissal from men who thought women couldn't farm. Evie had looked directly at the camera, expression calm and unyielding. "They laughed because I used mules. But they also laughed because I was a woman farming alone. I proved them wrong twice, not by talking, by lasting." The documentary aired in October, won a regional Emmy, brought more attention. Evie continued not wanting and continued getting anyway. The Missouri Agriculture Hall of Fame inducted her in '96. The Extension Service at the university invited her to speak to students studying farm management. Governor sent a congratulatory letter that now sat in a drawer somewhere unframed because framing it felt like showing off. Through all of it, Evie kept doing what she'd always done. Showed up, did the work, made decisions based on what needed doing rather than what would impress people. The recognition was fine. Didn't change anything important. Amelia graduated in May of '95, Bachelor of Science in Agricultural Economics, summa cum laude job offers from 2 consulting firms and the Farm Credit Administration. Turned them all down. Drove home to Barton County the week after commencement, unpacked her belongings in the room that had been hers since age 2, announced she was staying. Judith found her at the kitchen table that first evening, back spreadsheets covering every available Surface laptop, new technology that still felt slightly unreal, open to commodity price tracking software. You could work anywhere, make more money, see more of the world. Judith sat across from her daughter the way Evie had once sat across from her history, repeating in ways both understood without needing to articulate. "Why here?" "Because this is where I belong." Amelia looked up. Eyes that same shade of blue as her grandmother's. Same determination in the set of her jaw. "Grandma built something that matters. You helped it grow. I want to take it further." Evie taught her systematically through the following year, transferring 4 decades of knowledge the same way Win Ashcroft had once transferred it to Evie. Equipment maintenance first, how to diagnose problems by sound, by smell, by the feel of vibrations that shouldn't be there. Then soil management, crop rotation, the delicate balance between maximizing yield and maintaining long-term fertility. Then markets, commodity trading, the endless chess game of deciding when to sell and when to hold based on factors ranging from weather forecasts to geopolitical events that seemed unrelated until suddenly they weren't. Amelia absorbed it with the quick comprehension of someone young enough that learning still came easy, but experienced enough to understand context. She'd grown up watching, helping, listening. Now she was actively making decisions that mattered, developing judgment that couldn't be taught, only earned through practice and occasional failure. Spring of '96 brought Amelia's first significant negotiation. 3,000 bushels of corn to sell, market price at $3.20 per bushel, delivery to the grain elevator in Lamar, where the same families had been running operations for 3 generations. Evie suggested Amelia handle it alone, watching from the truck while her granddaughter went inside. The buyer was young, maybe 30, new to the position, trying to establish authority he hadn't quite earned. Made the mistake of seeing a 24-year-old woman and assuming inexperience he could exploit. $3.20 a bushel. He barely looked up from his paperwork. Standard price for standard grade. Lancaster Grain in Nevada is paying $3.40. Amelia kept her voice level, stating fact rather than arguing. I called this morning to confirm. That's for volume orders. Minimum 5,000 bushels. The condescension in his tone suggested he thought she didn't know what volume meant. I have 3,000 here. Another 2,000 coming next week. That's volume. Amelia placed her delivery slip on his desk, waited while he processed the implication. He looked up, reassessing. You're from the Whitmore operation, 3rd generation. My grandmother taught me that settling for less than fair value is the same as giving away profit for no reason. She smiled, not friendly but not hostile either. So, $3.40 or I drive to Nevada. The buyer calculated, quickly recognized he'd underestimated and couldn't afford to lose a client relationship over 20 cents per bushel. $3.40. But next time lead with the fact you're bringing volume. Next time lead with your best price. Amelia collected her paperwork. Saves us both time. Evie watched the exchange through the truck's window, close enough to intervene if necessary, far enough that Amelia had to handle it herself. When her granddaughter climbed back in satisfaction evident in the slight upturn of her mouth, Evie nodded approval. What did you get? $3.50. Better than $3.40. He ended at $3.40. I pushed for $3.50 and he agreed to split the difference. $3.45. Amelia started the truck, backed out of the lot. Figure an extra nickel per bushel on 3,000 is $150. Pays for a week of groceries. Your grandfather would have been proud. Evie looked out at fields, passing by land that had been in their family for half a century, would hopefully stay for half more. You handled that exactly right. The years between '96 and '98 passed in the rhythm that comes when a farm runs well, seasonal cycles repeating, each slightly different but following patterns old as agriculture itself. Evie turned 80, then 81, slowing down in ways she couldn't ignore even if she refused to let them stop her. Needed help now with tasks she'd once handled alone. Tired earlier, needed more rest. Woke up some mornings where the arthritis in her hands made gripping tools difficult until the joints warmed up. March of '98 brought a doctor's appointment Evie had postponed 3 times before Judith physically drove her there. Checkup routine. Nothing that should have required more than 20 minutes and a clean bill of health adequate for someone 83 years old. The doctor found the heart murmur immediately, referred her to a specialist in Springfield who did an echocardiogram and delivered news that landed like a physical blow despite being spoken gently. Congestive heart failure. Early stage but progressing. The specialist showed her images she didn't fully understand. Explained in language simplified for laypeople that her heart was wearing out the way any muscle wears out after 8 decades of constant work. Medication could help. Lifestyle changes could slow progression. But the trajectory was clear and the endpoint inevitable. How long? Hard to say with certainty. Could be 6 months. Could be 2 years. Depends on how well you respond to treatment and whether you experience any acute episodes. The specialist woman in her 40s with kind eyes and careful hands met Evie's gaze without flinching. I'm sorry. I know this isn't what you wanted to hear. Evie absorbed it the way she'd absorbed every other piece of difficult information life had thrown at her, acknowledged it, processed it, began planning around it. No point in denying reality. Reality didn't care whether you accepted it gracefully or fought it bitterly. It arrived regardless. What do I need to do? The medication regimen started that week. 4 pills daily, monitoring her salt intake, regular checkups to track progression. Evie followed instructions, precisely the same methodical approach she brought to maintaining equipment or managing finances. If the pills would buy her time, she'd take the pills. If reducing salt helped, she'd reduce salt. But she wouldn't pretend it changed the fundamental trajectory. 3 months. Maybe less. She told Judith on the drive home from Springfield, matter of fact and calm. I can feel it. The doctor's being optimistic because that's what doctors do. But I know what this is. Mom, you don't know that. Judith's hands gripped the steering wheel too tight, knuckles white against tan skin. People live with heart conditions for years. Some do, some don't. Evie watched countryside pass by, familiar landscape she'd known for 60 years and wouldn't know much longer. I need to get things in order. Make sure you and Amelia know where everything is, what needs doing. The letters took 2 weeks to write, drafts and redrafts until she got the words right. 3 letters, each serving different purpose. For Judith, an envelope sealed with wax, the old-fashioned way, her daughter's name written in Evie's careful handwriting. My dear Judy, you came back when I needed you most. That took more courage than anything I've done. You could have stayed in Springfield, stayed angry at me for not being the mother you wanted when you were young. Instead, you came home and helped build something that will outlast both of us. The farm is yours now. Every acre, every decision, everything. Fletcher is your partner in this, and I trust you'll work together the way successful partnerships require. But the final say is yours because you earned it. Don't farm it because you think you owe me something. Farm it because you love it, or sell it because you don't. Either way, I'll be proud of your choice because it will be yours to make. I wish I'd been better at telling you I loved you when you were growing up. Seemed easier to show it through work than say it with words. But I did love you. Do love you. Always will wherever I am when you read this. Your mother. For Amelia, similar envelope, similar care. Amelia, you're the reason I held on as long as I did. When Judith brought you home as a baby, I knew this legacy needed to continue. Not because farming is inherently noble or special, but because having land you own outright debt-free gives freedom that can't be measured in dollars. You're the 3rd Whitmore woman to work this soil. That makes me prouder than any award or recognition ever could. But don't let it trap you. If farming is your passion, wonderful. If not, also wonderful. This land should serve you, not enslave you. I've watched you grow from uncertain toddler to confident woman who can negotiate grain prices and manage equipment and understand markets I never quite mastered. You have your grandfather's intelligence and your grandmother's stubbornness. Use both wisely. The tractors in the barn represent more than machinery. They represent patience, the willingness to prepare for opportunities you can't predict but trust will come. Keep them running. Not because they're special, but because they remind us that being different isn't wrong when different is what survives. Be brave, Amelia. Not reckless brave, but deliberate brave. The kind that chooses a path and walks it despite everyone saying you shouldn't. Your Grandma Evie. For the Clayton and Evelyn Whitmore. Women Farmers Fund instructions, rather than sentiment. Use this money to help women farmers who are told they can't. Widows trying to keep land after losing husbands. Young women starting operations everyone says will fail. Any woman facing the assumption that farming is men's work and she should quit before she embarrasses herself. Don't give handouts. Give opportunities. Loans at fair interest. Equipment partnerships. Education grants. Whatever helps them help themselves. Tell them Evelyn Whitmore said they can do it. Not because it's easy, but because anything worth doing is hard, and being told you can't is just noise that means nothing if you choose not to hear it. May brought warmth that felt excessive after a mild spring, temperatures climbing into the 90s by mid-month. Evie spent more time in the house, now less able to tolerate heat that a decade ago wouldn't have bothered her. She sat in the rocking chair by the upstairs window, looking out over fields where corn came up green and strong, where the future she wouldn't see was already taking root. Judith found her there one afternoon, book unopened, in her lap, expression peaceful. How are you feeling? Tired. Not bad tired, just ready tired. Evie gestured to the view. I've been watching this land for 60 years, seems like enough, don't talk like that. Judith sat on the floor beside the chair position that made her feel young again, like she was 8 years old, seeking comfort from a mother who showed love through presence rather than words. I'm 83, sweetheart. Talking like this is just honest. Evie's hand found her daughter's hair, stroked it the way she used to when Judith was small. I've had a good run. Better than I deserved, probably. Can't ask for more than that. I'm not ready to lose you. Nobody's ever ready. Evie's voice carried gentleness. But it happens regardless. Best we can do is make sure the important things get said while there's still time. They sat in silence as the sun dropped toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and red that would have been beautiful if either of them had been in the mood to appreciate it. Early June brought the beginning of the end. Evie woke one Thursday, unable to catch her breath, chest tight in ways the medication usually prevented. The ambulance arrived within 15 minutes, EMTs professional and efficient, recognizing immediately that this wasn't something fixable at home. Hospital in Lamar first, then transfer to Springfield, when the local doctors admitted they couldn't offer treatment beyond making her comfortable. 3 days in Springfield, tests confirming what everyone already knew: the heart was giving out, process accelerating faster than the medications could counter. Nothing left except managing pain and buying whatever time could be bought, hours or days, but probably not weeks. Evie made the decision Friday afternoon, doctor presenting options that weren't really options at all. "I want to go home." Her voice came weak but firm. "Not going to die in a hospital if I can die in my own bed looking at my own land." They discharged her Saturday morning, hospice nurse arranging to visit daily pain medication prescribed at levels that would keep her comfortable, even if they shortened the time remaining. Judith drove her home. Fletcher and Amelia waiting at the farmhouse upstairs bedroom, prepared with everything the hospice nurse said they'd need. Sunday through Wednesday passed in a morphine haze, Evie drifting in and out of consciousness, occasionally lucid enough for brief conversations. The family took shifts. Someone always present, holding her hand or reading aloud or just sitting in the silence that sometimes matters more than words. Thursday evening brought unexpected clarity, the kind that sometimes arrives near the end when the body gathers itself for one final effort. Evie woke fully mind sharp, despite the pain and the medication, aware this was likely her last chance to speak words that needed speaking. The three of them gathered: Judith, Fletcher, Amelia. Mike Bennett arrived after Judith called old friend who'd been part of this story long enough that his presence felt necessary. Evie looked at each in turn, memorizing faces she wouldn't see again after tonight. Her voice emerged rough but audible. "Judith, thank you for coming back. Thank you for giving me a reason to keep going when I could have quit." Judith cried silently, holding her mother's hand between both of hers. "Fletcher, take care of them. You're a good man. Clayton would have liked you." Fletcher nodded, couldn't speak past the thickness in his throat. "Amelia, the tractors." Her breathing came labored, words costing effort she barely had to spare. "Keep them running, not because they're special, because they remind us to wait for the right moment, and to be ready when it comes." "I will, Grandma." Amelia leaned close, tears running down her face unchecked. "I promise." Evie's eyes found Mike last. "You learned. That's more than most people manage." Mike smiled, despite the grief, the expression sad and proud simultaneously. "You were patient with me, more than I deserved." The conversation exhausted her. Evie sank back into pillows, breathing shallow and irregular, pulse weak but still present. They sat vigil through the night, taking turns sleeping in the chair or on the floor, making sure she wasn't alone. Friday morning, June 18, 1998. First light came through the window, illuminating the room in gold and amber, touching the bed where Evelyn Whitmore lay with her daughter holding her left hand and her granddaughter holding her right. Fletcher stood at the foot of the bed. Mike sat in the chair nearby. Evie's eyes opened one final time, focused on something beyond the window, beyond the visible horizon. Her lips moved, forming words too quiet to hear, but clear enough in their intent. Clayton's name spoken like greeting rather than goodbye. She stopped breathing at 6:47, peaceful and ready, passing as gently as anyone could hope to pass after 83 years of living deliberately and dying the same way. The funeral drew 500 people, largest gathering the county had seen in years. Farmers from 6 counties. People from the Farm Bureau, students from the university, women Evie had helped through the fund she'd established, women who'd survived because someone believed they could. Garrett Crawford spoke, 91 years old and frail but insistent on paying respects to the woman who'd bought his land and saved him from complete ruin. His voice shook but carried. "Evie Whitmore taught me the hardest lesson a man can learn. Being right isn't about being loud, it's about lasting. She lasted. We're all here because she showed us how." Mike Bennett spoke next, reading from prepared remarks because he didn't trust himself to speak extemporaneously. "I spent 15 years trying to change Evie's mind about farming. She never budged. Not because she was stubborn, though she was, but because she was certain. She knew what mattered and didn't let anyone convince her otherwise. I'm grateful she was patient enough to teach me what I was too proud to learn on my own." The service lasted 90 minutes. Burial followed in the cemetery behind First Baptist Church, next to Clayton, who'd been waiting 43 years for her to join him. The tombstone Judith had ordered was simple granite with plain lettering. Evelyn Porter Whitmore, 1915 to 1998. She kept her promises. 12 years passed. The seasons cycled through patterns older than memory, soil receiving seed and returning harvest, generations replacing generations in the endless rhythm that defines agricultural time. Judith reached 63 in 2010, white hair pulled back in the same bun Evie had favored, hands showing the same wear from the same work. Fletcher still farmed alongside her, older and slower but steady, the kind of reliable presence that matters more than flash. Amelia, 38, now ran the operation, day-to-day decisions hers to make, with Judith's advice available but not mandatory. 720 acres expanded twice more since Evie's death, opportunities taken when they aligned with resources available. The operation thrived in ways that would have made Evie proud, modern equipment and technology married to the conservative financial principles she'd instilled. Amelia had married Owen Talbot in 2003, agricultural engineer who understood both farming and the woman who did it. Their daughter Evelyn, called Evie by everyone who knew her, turned 5 in February, blonde hair and blue eyes that marked her as continuation of a line stretching back through generations. The Clayton and Evelyn Whitmore Women Farmers Fund had grown from the original $50,000 to $275,000 through careful management and additional contributions from people who believed in its mission. 71 women had received assistance. 14 still farmed successfully, operations they'd built with help when banks and families and conventional wisdom all said they should quit. The barn still held both farmalls, maintained according to Evie's instructions, started monthly by whoever had time that day. Usually Amelia, sometimes Judith, occasionally Owen when the women were occupied elsewhere. The tractors ran perfectly, despite being 63 and 56 years old respectively, testimony to care and patience and understanding that some things matter beyond their practical utility. Young Evie loved those tractors, climbed onto their seats when no one was looking, pretended to drive them while making engine noises that approximated reality close enough for a 5-year-old. Her mother found her there on a Saturday afternoon in late June, small hands gripping the Farmall M's steering wheel, expression serious with the weight of imaginary responsibility. "Why do we keep these old tractors, Mama?" The question came with genuine curiosity, not challenge. Amelia lifted her daughter down, settled her on the barn floor, crouched to meet her at eye level. "Because your great-great-grandma Evie bought them a long time ago. Everyone told her to use them right away. She didn't listen." "Why not?" "Because she was waiting for the perfect moment. And when that moment came, she was ready." Amelia gestured to the barn, to the tractors, to the land visible through the open door. "These tractors represent something important." "What?" "That being different is okay if different is what works. That patience beats rushing. That you should prepare for opportunities you can't predict, but trust will come." Young Evie's forehead wrinkled, processing concepts slightly beyond her years but not beyond her reach with time. Was she scared every single day? Amelia's voice carried certainty, but she did it anyway. That's what brave means, not being unafraid, just doing what needs doing even when you are afraid. The plaque hung on the barn wall, brass weathered to green in places but words still legible. Evelyn Porter, Whitmore, 1915 to 1998. She farmed with mules when everyone said, use tractors. She farmed alone when everyone said, remarry or sell. She saved when everyone said, borrow and expand. She waited when everyone said, act now. She proved that strength isn't about being a man, it's about keeping your word. 4 generations of Whitmore women honor her memory. Amelia started the Farmall M engine, turning over once, twice, catching on the 3rd try, and settling into the steady rhythm it had maintained for 63 years. Young Evie watched wide-eyed while her mother made final adjustments, checking gauges and listening for problems that weren't there. 720 acres of Missouri farmland stretched beyond the barnland that had supported 4 generations and would hopefully support more, debt-free and productive and enduring in ways that made all the waiting worthwhile. The tractors kept running. The land kept producing. The women kept farming. And somewhere, in whatever place people go when they've finished their work and left their legacy, Evelyn Whitmore rested, knowing she'd kept every promise that mattered.